Carl reached out to me to ask if I would talk about Cinco de Mayo, the history of this celebration. And, you know, I wrote an article about Cinco de Mayo. It's over 20 years ago now. And I first learned about the celebration, really tried to understand it, when I was on the Board of Supervisors. I had a general idea that this was about, you know, a battle in a war between Mexico and France. But I didn't know that what started the battle was that Mexico had made a decision not to pay foreign debts. And so Benito Juarez, who was elected President of Mexico, decided that they were going to suspend foreign debt payments for 2 years. And I thought this was very interesting because we spent a lot of time thinking about how, you know, you have the World Bank and the IMF and all these different organizations and banks that often exploit countries and take their natural resources and, in effect, destabilize these countries and make it impossible for them to build infrastructure, to feed their own people, and to do all the things that you know, you need to do, particularly when you're not in the first world country. So Juarez had been the governor of Oaxaca, and he was on the Mexican Supreme Court. The title was President of the Supreme Court, and then he was elected President of Mexico. There was a big battle at the time between the liberals, which included Juarez, and the conservatives that wanted to keep the dominance of the church and suppress the kind of land reforms and wage reforms that were necessary to push Mexico forward. So when Juarez became president, one of the things about this debt that was owed that sat very uncomfortably with his government was that it was a debt that had been incurred by the conservatives as they tried to fight against liberal reform. And so the French, the English, the Spaniards were all upset by the suspension of the debt payments. They sent military boats to Veracruz, where there's a custom house and where you pay taxes and import duties, thinking that they would collect their money there. And everybody agrees that the English and the Spanish decided to return home when they realized the French intended to use this as a pretext to take over Mexico and to expand their influence. Now, there's a lot you'll hear. It was Napoleon's army that fought at Puebla, Cinco de Mayo. It's not Napoleon Bonaparte's army. That was much earlier. His son reigned for a very short period of time, maybe a month before he died. Napoleon III was a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, but he imposed himself. Originally democratically chosen leader, decided that he was going to be an emperor. The French invited Maximilian, who was part of the Austrian Habsburg Empire, and they sort of convinced him that Mexico wanted him to be their emperor. And he didn't get along very well with his brother, who was the Habsburg ruler, and he had a lot of difficulties in various posts that he had, and he was second in command to the throne. But he decided that he would go to Mexico, and so on his behalf, the French invaded Mexico, and one of the early battles was in 1862. This was the Battle of Puebla, and it happened on Cinco de Mayo. And the significant thing is that the French were defeated temporarily. They did not, they lost, and they were not accustomed to losing. They hadn't lost in several decades in warfare. The Mexicans under General Zaragoza, apparently the terrain was very wet from rainstorms, and the story goes that they used a stampede of cattle into the French army, almost like a cavalry charge, but without cavalry, and swept in afterwards, and that's what allowed them to be victorious. So the French, Napoleon III sent more troops, and it would take about a year, 13 months, for them to arrive in Mexico and take Mexico City. And they, about a little less than a year after that, Maximilian arrived in Mexico to be the emperor, and he surprised a lot of people during his reign. He turned out to be sympathetic to the Mexican people. He did not want to send all of the wealth to Europe. He supported reforms in the church. He continued the land reforms that Juarez wanted. There were some places where he was more liberal than Juarez. There were other places where Juarez was more liberal than him. But it's just very ironic. Napoleon III did not pick the person that he thought he was picking. At some point, Maximilian offered amnesty to Juarez and to the other democratically elected leaders in Mexico in an effort to try to put his government together. Juarez rejected it. There's some accounts that Maximilian had a death warrant or sentence out for Juarez, even though he was very kind to supporters who wanted to come back. So there's a lot of, it was very complicated and contradictory. Juarez was able to regain Mexico because Napoleon III withdrew the support of Maximilian. And he did it because Maximilian was not a puppet to him. When Maximilian was in, I think the place is Querétaro, where he was killed, he was killed by a firing squad. There were a lot of European leaders that appealed to Benito Juarez to say, don't execute him, just send him back to Europe. But Juarez felt that he needed to make a statement that he could not, Mexico could not tolerate having foreigners just imposed as their emperors. So Maximilian, there was a plan to help him escape Mexico. They had bribed the guards, and they were going to get him out of Mexico. However, he refused to go unless the two generals that had been captured with him also could escape with him, which wasn't apparently possible. And the second thing is that he refused. They wanted him to shave his beard off, and he refused because he didn't think it would be dignified if he were caught trying to escape having shaved his beard, and it wouldn't look very emperor-like. So he was executed in Querétaro. They say he gave a gold coin to everybody on the firing assembly that were going to kill him, basically. And he spoke very positively about Mexico. He spoke in Spanish. He forgave the soldiers that were going to shoot him. And it's just a very complicated story. He obviously went to Mexico believing that the people wanted him and wanted him to serve them. Main reasons why the Cinco de Mayo celebration became very popular in the United States. Even, it's often been said it's celebrated here, but not in Mexico at the same level. One of the reasons is that there were these patriotic committees that formed in California after Cinco de Mayo in the Latino community that included Mexicans, but also included Chileans and Peruvians who were working as laborers in the mines. And they were doing a lot of work separating mercury and gold mining and things like that. And they supported the cause of the Mexicans to defeat the French. And so early California newspapers of that era have little invitations to go to Cinco de Mayo events that were meant to raise money to help Benito Juarez's government defeat the French, because everybody knew the French were going to come back. And in these celebrations, these committees formed to raise money. They had food, they had beauty pageants, they did the whole thing. They had a lot of fun and community at the same time they were raising money for a cause. And they continued year to year. And at some point, it's believed that these celebrations slowly became more sort of Mexican-American dominated, but the origins were much more multicultural. The second reason it's believed that the Cinco de Mayo celebration became popular here is the impact that the defeat of Napoleon's army had on the American Civil War. The French intended to aid the Confederates after they took over Mexico. And the Confederacy was desperate to get recognized by the French, by the English, by anybody in Europe, because they were also already trading and trying to keep trade routes happening in the Gulf of Mexico, right, in the area of Mexico and Texas. So the defeat at Puebla meant that the French, they were delayed in taking over Mexico, and that delay happened at the same time, not at the same time, but a little less than a year probably before Gettysburg happened. And Gettysburg is where Robert E. Lee goes into the North with the intention to be on the offensive and try to get to Maryland or Washington or do all these things. And the defeat of Lee's army by it was General Meade means that the South was in retreat after that, and so there was never that opportunity. The American Civil War came to an end in 1865, and Philip Sheridan, the main cavalry officer, is known to have decommissioned his soldiers with a promise that they would fight with Juarez in Mexico. And so it's believed that a lot of those soldiers who finished the American Civil War, fought in Mexico, may have brought back the tradition of Cinco de Mayo, which had become something like, the Alamo. Remember the Alamo? It was a sense of pride that the French had been defeated once and could be expelled from Mexico. And these are believed to be some of the ways the history took form.
Mi nombre es Margarita Triana, soy del ejido Jalisco, Coahuila, municipio de Torreón, Coahuila, trabajadora de la maquiladora del Testa Nazareno.
So she says, hello, everyone. Good night. Her name is Margarita Triana. She's the Secretary of Equity and Gender for the Mexican Labor Union League and works now at a maquiladora in Nazareno.
Pues mi historia empezó cuando nos empezamos a organizar para formar un sindicato independiente en nuestra planta, en nuestro trabajo, y pues lamentablemente como en muchas ocasiones pues nos despidieron injustificadamente a mí y a otras tres compañeras por estarnos organizando a lo del sindicato independiente. Ya en ese entonces pues nos daba el acompañamiento del CFO, tanto en talleres como en organización. Se logró la reinstalación de las cuatro compañeras por medio de las marcas y pues en todo momento se nos dio el acompañamiento y la asesoría del CFO, tanto legal como en pláticas, apoyo moral y todo. Y pues ahorita ya tenemos un comité seccional dentro de planta que pertenece a la Liga Sindical Obrera Mexicana. Nos organizamos, logramos tener la titularidad del contrato y tener nuestro comité dentro de planta, apoyar a los trabajadores y trabajadoras a defender los derechos laborales. Y yo ahorita actualmente también formo parte del Comité Ejecutivo Nacional de la Liga Sindical como secretaria de Equidad e Igualdad de Oportunidades. Para mí sí fue así como un cambio así bien enorme, porque pues yo nunca imaginé que después de ese despido que tuve, iba a regresar a mi trabajo y mucho menos que iba a formar parte del Comité Nacional del Sindicato, de la Liga, y pues poder ayudar a todas nuestras compañeras y compañeros de todo lo que vivimos a diario en la maquila donde trabajamos. Y pues ha sido muy importante el acompañamiento que nos brindó CFO, ya sea en los talleres que nos daba de GEMA, de salud e higiene, cómo ayudar a las compañeras trabajadoras que eran madres solteras y tenían a cargo a sus hijos y hijas y aún así tenían que ir a trabajar todos los días. Nos ha servido mucho esos talleres porque así podemos dar seguimiento y trato a todos nuestros compañeros y compañeras dentro de planta y poderles apoyar y brindar un poco de lo que nosotros hemos aprendido a lo largo de estos 3 años que llevamos organizándonos.
So Marguerite is saying that her story started when they began to organize to form an independent union at the maquiladora where she works. So she comments that sadly, in many other occasions, her and 3 other workers were fired for trying to organize, but with the help of the CFO, they were able to be reinstated, and with help of the brand's organization as well. And so now they have, I have here, now she was reinstated along with her seniority, and she is now a member of the Gender Equality Secretariat at LSOM. And they got a new contract. So she comments that they were able to get that independent union, and she now works as the secretary. And for her, this has been a huge change because she never imagined coming back to work after being fired, and much less being able to be a part of the union. She says that being able to help workers against this injustice has been something that she has really been grateful for so far. Here, let me unmute her again. Si tiene algo más, Margarita, por favor. Yeah.
Sí, pues, agradecerles por la invitación y pues contar un poquito de lo vivido como trabajadora, como madre de familia. Fue un gusto compartir un poquito de lo que hemos pasado al estar con este proceso de la libre sindicalización y pues también a Julia, al CFO, porque pues gracias a ellos nos dieron también las herramientas para poder defendernos nosotros y a nuestras compañeras y compañeros y pues ayudar un poquito a ver las cosas diferentes en nuestro trabajo y saber que sí se puede y que unidos los trabajadores y trabajadoras podemos tener mayores beneficios para nosotros y nuestras familias. Muchas gracias por la invitación.
Muchas gracias. So she says, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about her life as a worker and as a mother. She mentions she has 2 children, that she has been really grateful that she can support them financially with all of this help from the union. Well, she can support them more financially. And she says that there's a lot more that she could share, but due to due to time constraints, she unfortunately doesn't have the time tonight, but she has been very grateful to be a part of the fight to organize, and she thanks Julia for her support and for getting the opportunity to help her coworkers. She mentions that she believes that with solidarity, we can definitely make some change. Muchas gracias, Margarita.
Buenas noches, da gusto de verdad estar acá conectada con ustedes, ¿verdad? Agradezco a las personas, ¿verdad? Todas las personas que están por acá presentes y a quienes nos invitan también. Yo estoy aquí como parte del Comité Fronterizo de Obreras y Obreros, que somos una organización que promovemos los derechos humanos, laborales de las personas trabajadoras, principalmente las mujeres, acá en la zona de la frontera, ¿verdad? De la frontera norte, pues, del país. Entonces, pues, el día de hoy es una oportunidad para compartir lo que vivimos en la frontera, pero también creo que por esta fecha del 5 de mayo también, pues, es para traer a la mesa lo que, pues, no debe olvidarse, ¿no? Nuestra memoria colectiva como una herramienta de resistencia. Decir también que pues el 5 de mayo, un poco también escuchando las participaciones anteriores, pues miramos cómo puede llegar a ser una fecha que se vacía como de contenido, ¿no? En el discurso oficial y pues termina por convertirse, digamos, en una cosa superficial o en un festejo superficial. Y entonces lo que pasa que eso hace que olvidemos el sentido profundo, ¿no? De lo que ocurrió, lo que estamos conmemorando hoy, que es la batalla de Puebla, ¿no? Entonces, ¿qué es lo que recordamos? Pues un pueblo organizado, ¿verdad? Un pueblo organizado sin un ejército profesional que derrotó, pues ahora sí que el imperialismo. Pensar también como en la defensa de la soberanía, pues no fue como un acto que se llevara a cabo desde el gobierno, sino justo desde las comunidades que deciden pues no someterse al poder extranjero, ¿no? O a una élite pues, que no los representaba. Entonces, pues, no sé si doy como un espacio para la traducción y quizás como continuar.
Muchas gracias. So Yukari says, good evening, everyone. She's very pleased to be here and thanks everyone in attendance and those who donated. She is here on behalf of CFO, which is the Border Workers Committee, known as CFO in Mexico, who principally serves workers and women on the northern border of Mexico, or the northern region. It's important, she says, to talk about the reality that workers face in Mexico. And on this Cinco de Mayo, it's also important to talk about resistance, most of all. Sometimes she mentions that the Cinco de Mayo celebrations are kind of surface level because we forget the important history that was shared here tonight about taking down imperialism and really, making sure that we build a movement of resistance. She says that communities are the ones who decide not to submit to foreign powers or leaders who don't represent them, and it's important to remember that.
Vale, gracias. Pues quizás continuar con compartirles, ¿verdad? A todos quienes están por allá, que el Comité Fronterizo de Obreras y Obreros es una organización de base que promueve la democracia sindical, los derechos de las personas trabajadoras, como ya había mencionado en un inicio, pues en las ciudades de la frontera con Estados Unidos. Yo ahora mismo estoy en Torreón, Coahuila, pero bueno, digamos que la base o la sede está en Piedras Negras y se trabaja también desde otros estados, ¿verdad? Pues la finalidad del CFO es como mejorar, ¿no? Mejorar las condiciones de trabajo dentro de las empresas maquiladoras, dentro de las fábricas y que las personas a través de la educación popular vayan aprendiendo sobre sus derechos, a defender sus derechos, y nos centramos mucho como en la población de mujeres, ¿no? Desde el CFO, pues, que ya lleva más de 3 décadas haciendo trabajo de base con las personas que trabajan en Maquila. Entonces, como que siento que esta lucha de la que estamos hablando o esta historia de la que estamos hablando, pues es nuestra, ¿no? En cada taller o cada juntanza, cada acompañamiento psicosocial o acompañamiento legal que se hace desde CFO, pues yo pensaría que nace como desde esta misma raíz que es la convicción, ¿no? De que el pueblo, de que la base trabajadora, de que la clase trabajadora tiene, pues, tiene el derecho a decidir, ¿no? Sobre su destino, a hablar, a nombrar sus propios, digamos, dolores, y pues a construir también soluciones.
Muchas gracias. So she says CFO is an organization that promotes union democracy, gender rights for workers, and mainly in cities on the border with the US. She talks about the goal of CFO, which is to improve conditions in maquiladoras and to educate people using popular education techniques to defend their labor rights. They have more than 30 years experience working and organizing workers, and she feels that the story of Cinco de Mayo belongs to the people, to workers. It's born from the conviction of the working class and knowing that they have the right to demand better conditions and solutions. Y ya si quiere ya empezar a acabar, Yukari, ya sé que ya son las 8.
Oh, wow. Claro, sí. Pues quizás un poco como para hacer el cierre, ¿verdad? Pensamos que, bueno, pienso que la historia del 5 de mayo es importante porque justo nos recuerda que nos podemos organizar, inclusive cuando pensamos que la contraparte parece más fuerte, ¿no? Entonces yo pensaría que la verdadera lucha, pues, es justo no tener que pedir permiso por quienes somos. Entonces, decirles que, pues, yo trabajo con mucha satisfacción con el Comité Fronterizo de Obreras y Obreros, porque pues vamos impulsando estos procesos de formación, ¿no? Estas juntanzas en donde a través de la educación popular, pues, los saberes se comparten, entonces, pues vamos construyendo, ¿no? Vamos transformando, y pues ese sería como un cierre, y desde luego decirles gracias a nombre del comité y a nombre personal también. Ha sido un gusto mirarles y estar por acá, y seguro estamos como con disposición de volver a estar con ustedes.
Muchas gracias. So just for our English speakers, really quick, she believes that the story of Cinco de Mayo is important to share so that we know that there's strength in numbers in organizing. The real goal is not to have to apologize for demanding better conditions, and she loves the work that she does at CFO because she's able to see the change firsthand and help to build that resistance movement. She ends by saying thank you on behalf of CFO, and she's especially grateful to be here.
Thank you. Gracias. Muchas gracias.